All right. So have you ever been in like an argument with someone where, you just KNW you were right, but you couldn't quite put your finger on like why the other person's logic was just off?
Yeah, me too. It happens all the time, right? And it turns out there's this whole world of like flawed reasoning and
Yeah.
mm, knowing how to spot these tricks can be really helpful. They're called fallacies. And you sent over this cool book, How to Win Every Argument, and it's all about these fallacies. So today we're gonna look at some of the most common ones, the ones you'll probably run into, in your daily life, and hopefully give you some tools to spot them. Just the other day, I was talking with my neighbor, and we were going back and forth about, well, it doesn't even matter what it was about, but he hit me with this line: "Everyone on the block agrees with me, so you must be wrong." And I was like, hold on, that's not how logic works. But I couldn't really explain why. Turns out, he was using what they call the bandwagon fallacy, or like argumentum ad populum. It's like, oh, saying something's true just because, a lot of people believe it. But we all know, like, throughout history, popular opinion has been wrong a lot. It's like, what exactly is a fallacy? Why should we even care about them? Well, a fallacy is basically like a flaw in the reasoning that makes an argument invalid. It's kind of like, if you think about a house, it's like a crack in the foundation. It might look okay from the outside, but, it weakens the whole structure. And I think recognizing these fallacies is really important for a few reasons. Like, first, it helps us, avoid being tricked by bad arguments, like arguments that sound good on the surface, but if you look closely, they kind of fall apart, right? Second, it helps us make our own arguments stronger. By understanding how these fallacies work, we can make sure our own arguments make sense and they're, actually persuasive. And finally, I think it just helps us be better thinkers in general, because let's be real, the world is full of bad arguments, right? You see them everywhere, from advertising to politics to just like everyday conversations. So the better we are at spotting these fallacies, the better we can, navigate all of this information. Okay, let's dive into a few of the most common ones, the ones you'll probably see. First up, the ad hominem fallacy. This one's all about attacking the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. So, like, imagine you're talking about climate change with someone and they say, well, you can't trust anything that scientist says. He's, a big environmental activist. See what they did there? They're trying to like discredit the scientists instead of looking at the actual evidence. And that's classic ad hominem. It's like a distraction. It takes the focus away from the real issue. And, sometimes it can be really tempting to use like ad hominem attacks ourselves, right? Yeah.
Especially when we're feeling, defensive or emotional about something. But it's important to remember that a person's character doesn't automatically make their argument wrong. Even someone who's flawed can still make a good point. So, like, next time you're in an argument and you feel yourself wanting to, attack the other person, take a breath and try to focus on what they're actually saying. Okay, next up, the straw man fallacy. This one is all about misrepresenting someone's argument, to make it easier to attack. It's like building a straw man, something that's easy to knock down. So imagine someone's arguing that we should invest more in public transportation, right? And their opponent comes back with, so you want to ban all cars and force everyone to ride the bus.
Yeah.
Like, see how they twisted the original argument into something, extreme and kind of ridiculous. That's the straw man. They're not really engaging with the real argument. They're just creating like a distorted version of it that's easy to argue against. And this straw man fallacy is often used to just shut down a conversation, avoid a real debate. And it can be really frustrating to be on the receiving end of this, right? It's like, wait, that's not what I'm saying at all. But when we understand this fallacy, we can recognize it, we can call it out, be like, hey, it's not really what I'm saying. Let's stick to the real issue here. All right, let's talk about the false dilemma fallacy. This is the one where it's presented like there are only two options when there are actually more. It's that you're either with us or against us kind of thinking. Like, you imagine someone says, if you don't support this war, then you're unpatriotic. They're trying to like back you into a corner, make it seem like there are only two choices. But of course, there are other possibilities, right? You could be against the war for, moral reasons or strategic reasons or any number of reasons. And this false dilemma is often used to oversimplify things, shut down any kind of nuanced discussion. And it can be really dangerous, right? Because it leads to like people being polarized and divided. So next time someone hits you with a false dilemma, like take a step back. Ask yourself, are there other options here? Am I missing something? All right, I'm going to give you one more fallacy for this part, and then we'll take a little break, all right? This one is, it's kind of a personal favorite of mine because it's so common and it's so easy to fall for. It's the slippery slope fallacy. This is the one where they say, like, if one thing happens, then it'll inevitably lead to all these other bad things. Like, if we legalize marijuana, then everyone will be doing heroin.
Yeah.
They're creating this like slippery slope, this idea that one little step leads to disaster. Now, sometimes those slippery slope arguments can be valid, right? I mean, there are times when one action can actually lead to, a chain of consequences. But a lot of times these arguments are based on fear, more than actual evidence. They're trying to scare people by exaggerating the possible negative consequences. And we see this all the time in politics, right? If we raise taxes, it'll destroy the economy. If we allow more immigration, it'll lead to crime and chaos. These are often like slippery slope arguments just designed to play on people's fears. So how do we like protect ourselves from falling for these slippery slopes, these bad arguments? Well, the first step is, awareness, right? The more we understand about these fallacies, the more likely we are to like see them coming. And it's kind of amazing, Once you start like looking for these fallacies, you start to see them everywhere. It's a little bit depressing how common they are, but okay, moving on. Let's talk about another fallacy that I think, we've all probably fallen for at some point. It's called the appeal to authority fallacy. And this one can be tricky because, we do rely on experts, right? Like we need to trust people who know more than us about certain things. But this fallacy happens when we just accept an argument because it's coming from someone famous or someone in a position of authority, even if they don't actually know what they're talking about. You know what I mean? Like I remember one time I was watching a commercial for some kind of energy drink. And it had this like super buff celebrity talking about how this drink gave him, all this energy and focus. And I was like, wow, if he's saying it's good, it must be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But then I realized, like, wait a minute, he's an actor. He's not a doctor. He's not a nutritionist. He probably just got paid to say that, right?
Yeah.
So how do we avoid falling for this appeal to authority trap? Well, it all comes down to like critical thinking, right? We have to ask ourselves, is this person really qualified to be talking about this? Do they have the knowledge, the experience to back up what they're saying? Or are they just, a famous face being used to sell us something? Okay, let's talk about another fallacy that's often used to like shut down critical thinking, to kind of stifle any disagreement. It's called the appeal to tradition fallacy. This is the idea that something must be right or good just because it's been done that way for a long time. Like we've always done it this way, so why change?
Yeah.
I think we all have these traditions or beliefs that we hold on to, right? Even if we can't really explain why. But it's important to remember that just because something's been done a certain way for a long time doesn't automatically make it the best way or even a morally right way. I mean, think about it. Slavery was a tradition for centuries. But that doesn't mean it was right, does it? So how do we avoid falling for this appeal to tradition trap? Well, I think it's about being willing to, question things, to challenge the way things have always been done. Recognize that progress sometimes means breaking with tradition and trying something new. And I know it's not always easy to do that, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to traditions that are, really deeply rooted in our culture. But if we want to make the world a better place, a more just and fair place, we have to be willing to question the past. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a fallacy that's often used to, like, play on people's emotions. It's called the appeal to pity fallacy. also known as argumentum ad misericordiam, which is just a fancy way of saying, they're trying to make you feel sorry for them instead of actually making a logical argument. Like, imagine you're a teacher and you're grading a student's paper, and the student comes to you with this like sob story about how their week has been terrible. Their dog died, their car broke down, they didn't have time to study, and you might feel bad for the student, right? I mean, who wouldn't? But that doesn't change the fact that they didn't do the work. Their paper isn't good.
The appeal to piety is just trying to bypass the actual argument and go straight for your heartstrings. Now, I'm not saying that empathy is a bad thing, right? It's important to be understanding and supportive, especially when people are going through tough times. But we have to be careful not to let our emotions, completely cloud our judgment, especially when we're making important decisions or trying to figure out if an argument is actually valid. Okay, let's jump back to the ad hominem fallacy for a second. We talked about this one earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting because it comes in so many forms. Remember, the basic idea is attacking the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. But there are a couple of variations on this that I want to point out. First, you have the abusive ad hominem, which is just straight up name calling. You're arguing about politics and someone says, well, you're just an idiot. It's not an argument. That's just an insult, right? It doesn't address the issue at all. Then you have the circumstantial ad hominem, which is a little bit more subtle.
This is where you attack someone's argument by pointing out their background or their affiliations, implying that they can't be trusted because of who they are or what groups they belong to. Like someone might say, of course you support universal health care. You're a socialist. Or you can't trust anything that politician says. He's just a puppet for the corporations. Now, sometimes pointing out someone's circumstances can be relevant, right? Like, if they have a conflict of interest, it's fair to question their motives. But we have to be careful not to just dismiss someone's argument because of who they are or what groups they're associated with. We still need to, evaluate their argument based on its own merits. Okay, let's talk about a fallacy that's often used to justify doing nothing, to avoid taking action. It's called the appeal to ignorance fallacy. This is where someone says something must be true because it hasn't been proven false. Or, the other way around, no one's ever proven that Bigfoot doesn't exist, so he must be real. Or there's no evidence that this new technology is harmful, so it must be safe.
And it's important to remember that the burden of proof usually falls on the person making the claim.
Right.
If you're saying something is true, you need to provide the evidence. It's not up to other people to prove you wrong. And just because something hasn't been proven false doesn't automatically make it true. There's a lot we don't know about the world, right? But that doesn't mean we should just accept any claim that comes along.
All right, one more fallacy for this segment, and then we'll wrap things up. This one's called the false cause fallacy, also known as post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is Latin for after this, therefore because of this. Basically, it's assuming that just because one thing happened after another, then the first thing must have caused the second thing. Let's say you eat a burrito and then you get sick. You might think, oh, that burrito must have made me sick. But what if you were already coming down with something and the burrito was just a coincidence? Or what if you ate that burrito with a bunch of other people and none of them got sick? This false cause fallacy shows us how our brains try to find patterns,
even when those patterns don't actually exist. We see two things happen close together, and we assume they must be connected, even if there's no real evidence to support that. And it's important to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Just because two things happen at the same time or one after the other doesn't mean one caused the other. There could be other factors involved, or it could just be, totally random. So how do we avoid this false cause trap? Again, it's about critical thinking, about asking for evidence. If someone's saying that one thing caused another, we got to ask, what's the proof? Is there a logical explanation for how this could have happened? Or is it just, a coincidence? We can't just jump to conclusions. We always have to be willing to, question what we're being told.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We've talked about a bunch of different fallacies, from the ad hominem to the appeal to pity to the false cause. And hopefully this is giving you like a better understanding of how these things work, why they can be so persuasive, and how to avoid being tricked by them.
But I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that critical thinking is a skill. It's something we have to keep working on, keep practicing. The world is full of information and misinformation. And it's up to each of us to be careful, to be skeptical, to question things, to demand evidence, and to always be on the lookout for these fallacies. It's funny, the more I learn about all these fallacies, the more I realize how often I've probably used them myself, without even realizing it. Just the other day, I was having this argument with my friend, and I can't remember what it was about, but I caught myself using the to quote fallacy. That, you do it too kind of argument. Well, you did the same thing, so why are you giving me a hard time about it? It's such a classic way to deflect and avoid taking responsibility, and it's so easy to just fall back on those kinds of arguments when you're in the heat of the moment. But I think the more we learn about these fallacies, the more we can catch ourselves doing it and hopefully communicate in a more honest and logical way. I think one of the best things about learning about fallacies is that it helps us look at our own thinking, become more aware of our own biases. It's like holding up a mirror to yourself and saying, hey, are you really being rational here?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you letting your emotions or your own preconceptions cloud your judgment? And, it's not always fun to admit that we're not thinking as clearly as we could be. But I think it's really important if we want to become better thinkers, Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into these fallacies, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. First, remember that fallacies are everywhere. You'll see them in advertising, in politics, in the news, on social media, even in just everyday conversations.
Mm.
So be careful, be skeptical, and always be on the lookout for these little signs of flawed reasoning. Second, don't be afraid to call out fallacies when you see them. It's not about being a know-it-all or anything. It's about trying to have more honest and logical discussions. If someone's using a fallacy to try to manipulate you or mislead you, don't be afraid to say something. Be like, hey, I think you're using a false dilemma here. I think there are more options than that. Or I think you're attacking me instead of the argument. Can we just stick to the facts? And finally, remember that learning about these fallacies is a journey. It's not a destination. It's something you have to keep learning about, keep practicing. So stay curious, keep learning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of logical fallacies. I hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit entertaining. Until next time, stay skeptical, stay curious, and keep those brains working.